No one in the audience could have imagined what was about to happen. They'd come for the usual fair laughter, friendly competition, maybe a chance to win some money and make memories they could share at dinner tables for years to come. The Family Feud set glowed under its familiar lights, the board ready to reveal answers, the buzzers waiting to be slammed by eager hands. Steve Harvey stood at his mark, loose and comfortable in that way he had, ready to guide another family through questions about everyday things, favorite pizza toppings, common pet names, things people say when they're running late. But television, for all its scripted predictability, sometimes becomes a window into moments that no writer could imagine and no director could choreograph. Sometimes it catches lightning, and sometimes rarely, but powerfully, it witnesses the exact second when a person's entire world splits open. It happened during what should have been a light-hearted segment, a bonus round question. Simple enough. Name something people keep in their wallet besides money. The kind of question designed to be easy, to let families rack up points with obvious answers like photos, credit cards, driver's licenses. The contestant, a woman named Sarah Mitchell, had been doing well all episode. She was 34, a kindergarten teacher from a small town in North Carolina, playing alongside her husband and 2 teenage daughters. They were the kind of family America loves, wholesome, genuinely happy for each other's successes, gracious in their mistakes. Steve had asked the question with his trademark grin, expecting the usual answers, already preparing his response, whether they got it right or stumbled. The cameras were rolling. The studio audience was engaged but relaxed, settling into the rhythm of the game. Everything was exactly as it should be. Then Sarah said, "A photo of someone you lost." Her voice caught on the last word, just barely. A tiny fracture that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Steve Harvey had been doing this long enough to hear the weight underneath simple words. His smile softened slightly, became something gentler, and he nodded with that particular empathy he'd perfected over decades of listening to people's stories. "A photo of someone you lost," he repeated, and the answer lit up on the board number 3, worth 14 points. The audience applauded. Sarah's family hugged her. It should have ended there. A touching moment folded neatly into the game's progression, ready to move on to the next question. But Steve paused. He looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and something in her face made him set down his cards. "You got a photo like that?" he asked, his voice quieter now, the comedian giving way to the human being underneath. Sarah nodded. Her hand moved instinctively to her purse, sitting just off camera. The studio fell into a kind of expectant hush, that particular quality of silence that happens when people sense they're about to witness something real. "Would you?" Steve started, then stopped, seemed to reconsider. But Sarah was already reaching into her purse, her fingers finding what they'd touched 1,000 times before, what she carried everywhere because leaving it behind felt like abandoning someone all over again. She pulled out a worn photograph, its edges soft from years of handling, and held it up toward Steve. He stepped closer, squinting slightly to see it better under the lights. The camera zoomed in, capturing the image for the screens around the studio, for the viewers at home who would watch this moment again and again in the days to come, trying to understand what happened next. It was a photo of 2 young men, both in military uniforms, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the particular brightness of people who believe they're invincible. The sun was behind them, turning the edges of the photo golden, timeless. Steve Harvey stared at that photograph for 3 seconds, maybe 4. And in those seconds, something shifted in his face, a recognition, a confusion, a dawning horror that he was trying very hard not to show. "Ma'am," he said slowly, carefully, like a man walking across ice he wasn't sure would hold him. "Who is in this picture?" Sarah's voice was steady when she answered, though her eyes had begun to glisten. "That's my brother, Sergeant Marcus Wheeler. He was killed in action in Afghanistan, 11 years ago last month." The words landed in the silence like stones in still water. Steve Harvey didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at that photograph like it was a door that had suddenly opened onto a room he'd forgotten existed. And then, so quietly that the microphones barely caught it, he whispered, "Dear God, I know him." To understand what happened in that studio, you have to go back 11 years and 3,000 miles, to a different kind of stage, entirely a comedy club, in Jacksonville, Florida, where Steve Harvey had stopped during a tour that felt endless. It was one of those in-between cities, the kind that blurred together after decades of traveling, of hotel rooms and green rooms and audiences whose faces you forgot as soon as the lights went down. But Marcus Wheeler's face, Steve had never forgotten. The young soldier had been sitting in the third row, still in his uniform because he'd come straight from the base, his leave starting at midnight, and he'd wanted to catch the show before flying home to North Carolina to surprise his sister for her 23rd birthday. He'd laughed louder than anyone else that night, a genuine, uninhibited joy that cut through the usual comedy club atmosphere of forced enthusiasm and alcohol-loosened inhibitions. After the show, Marcus had waited by the stage door, not for an autograph, not for a photo, but because he'd wanted to say thank you. "My sister loves you," he'd told Steve, shaking his hand with the firm grip of someone who'd learned early that a handshake was a promise. "She watches your show every day. Says you remind her that the world can still be funny even when it's hard." They'd talked for 20 minutes. Steve, who usually kept these interactions brief, professional, found himself lingering. There was something about this kid 22 years old, with his whole life mapped out in front of him like a bright road. Marcus had talked about his plans. Finish his service, use his GI Bill to become a teacher like his sister, maybe coach football on the side. He'd pulled out his wallet to show Steve a photo of Sarah, beaming in her college graduation gown, and the pride in his voice when he said, "That's my baby sister," had been so pure, it made Steve think of his own siblings, his own journey from nothing to something. "She raised me, really," Marcus had said, his voice softening, "after our folks passed when I was 14. She was only 18 herself, but she dropped out of college for 2 years to make sure I finished high school, worked 2 jobs, made sure I ate before she did, made sure I had what I needed to be somebody." Steve had given Marcus a signed photo that night, not for Marcus, but for Sarah. He'd written on it, "To Sarah, your brother says you're the real hero. Keep being the light. Steve Harvey." Marcus had promised to give it to her when he got home, had shaken Steve's hand again, had walked off into the Jacksonville night with that easy confidence of young men who haven't yet learned that the world can break you. 3 months later, Marcus Wheeler had been killed by an improvised explosive device outside Kandahar. He'd been pulling a local child out of the road when it detonated. He'd saved the child's life and lost his own in the same breath. The way heroes do, the way people who were raised by sisters who taught them to give before they take often do. Steve had learned about it the way most people learn about tragedies that don't touch them directly. A news story, a scroll of names, a distant awareness that somewhere, someone was grieving. He'd thought about that kid from Jacksonville, wondered if he'd made it home safe. But the tour had moved on, and life had continued, and the memory had settled into that category of encounters you carry, without quite remembering why, until now. Until Sarah Mitchell stood in his studio holding a photograph of her brother, and Steve Harvey's past and present collided with the force of a bomb he'd never seen coming. Sarah didn't know any of this yet. She only knew that the man who'd made her laugh through some of her darkest days was staring at her brother's photo like he'd seen a ghost. And the confusion on her face was mirrored by every person in that studio who couldn't understand why Steve Harvey had gone so pale, why his hands were trembling slightly as he held that worn photograph, why he looked like a man who'd just been hit by something invisible but devastating. "You knew him?" Sarah whispered, and the question hung in the air like a prayer, like a hope she was afraid to name. Steve's throat worked. Once, twice. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "Jacksonville," he finally managed, his voice rough as gravel. 2012. October. Comedy show. He came to my show." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Her daughters, standing beside her, looked at each other in confusion, then at their mother, then at Steve Harvey, trying to piece together what was happening. The audience had gone completely silent now, that kind of silence that has texture and weight, that presses against your eardrums. "He was on leave," Steve continued, and each word seemed to cost him something. "He waited after the show. Told me about you. Told me." His voice broke. Steve Harvey, who'd spent 4 decades learning how to control his voice, how to deliver a punchline, how to comfort and command and entertain, couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah was crying now, not the gentle tears of nostalgia but the racking sobs of grief that had been waiting 11 years to find its witness. "He called me that night. she gasped between breaths. From Jacksonville. He said he'd met you. He said he'd gotten something for me, something special, but he wanted to give it to me in person. And then, he never. She couldn't finish either. The studio had transformed into something else entirely. This wasn't a game show anymore. This was a church, a confessional, a place where two people who'd loved the same young man were finding each other across the chasm of his absence. Steve Harvey set the photograph down on the podium with a gentleness reserved for sacred things, for objects that carry more weight than their physical form suggests. His hands were shaking visibly now, and he made no attempt to hide it. The cameras caught everything, the way his jaw clenched and released, the way his eyes kept returning to that image of two soldiers in golden sunlight, the way he seemed to age a decade in the span of a few seconds. "He told me about you," Steve said again, louder this time, his voice steadying even as his hands did not. "He told me you'd raised him after your parents died." He said. Steve paused, and you could see him traveling back through time, through 11 years and countless stages and millions of moments, trying to retrieve the exact words. When he spoke again, his voice carried the careful precision of someone handling something precious. "He said you were only 18 when they passed, that you gave up college to make sure he finished high school, that you worked yourself to the bone so he could have a future. He was so proud of you, ma'am. So proud that when he showed me your picture, his whole face lit up like you'd hung the moon yourself." Sarah's knees buckled slightly. Her husband caught her, held her upright, but his own face was streaked with tears now. Their daughters were clinging to each other, and across the studio, audience members were weeping openly, tissues appearing from purses and pockets. The collective grief of strangers who were learning in real time what it meant to witness the intersection of love and loss and impossible coincidence. "What was he doing in Jacksonville?" Sarah asked, though some part of her must have already known. Must have filled in the gaps from phone calls she'd had with her brother 11 years ago, from stories he'd told her about shore leave and comedy shows, and trying to grab joy wherever he could find it before deploying overseas. "He was on leave," Steve said. "Had a few hours before his flight home. He said he was going to surprise you for your birthday. Said he couldn't wait to see your face when he walked through the door." The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her 23rd birthday, the one Marcus had promised he'd be home for, the one where she'd waited all day checking her phone, watching the door, telling herself that military schedules were unpredictable, that he'd come when he could. He had come. He'd tried. He'd just run out of time on the way. "After the show," Steve continued, and his voice had taken on the quality of confession now, of testimony. "He waited for me by the stage door, and we talked. Really talked, the way you don't usually get to talk in those situations. He told me about his plans about coming home, about using his GI Bill to become a teacher. He said he wanted to be like you." Steve's voice cracked again on the word, "you," and he had to stop, had to press his fingers against his eyes for a moment before he could continue. "He pulled out his wallet," Steve said, and now he was looking directly at Sarah, holding her gaze across the distance between them, "and he showed me a picture of you in your graduation gown, and the way he talked about you, ma'am. I've met a lot of people in my life, a lot of people who love other people, but the way that boy loved you, the way he talked about your sacrifice and your strength, it was something I'd never quite heard before." The studio lights seemed to dim and brighten simultaneously, a trick of perception that happens when emotion overwhelms the senses. Someone in the audience let out a sob that sounded like it had been pulled from the depths of their chest. The camera operators were crying behind their equipment, and the director in the control room had long since abandoned any pretense of managing the show's pace, understanding instinctively that this moment needed all the time it required. "I gave him something that night," Steve said, and his hands had found his pockets now, searching for something to hold on to, some anchor in this storm of memory. "I signed a photo for you, wrote a message on it. He was so excited to give it to you. He said it would be part of your birthday present." Sarah's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her hands had moved to her chest, pressing against her heart as if trying to hold it inside her body. "He never," she finally managed. He never made it home for my birthday. He deployed 2 days later, and then 6 weeks after that." She couldn't say it, couldn't name the thing that had ended her brother's life and fractured her own into before and after, into the person she'd been when she still had a little brother, and the person she'd become when all she had left were photographs and memories, and the particular kind of grief that never quite heals, just learns to breathe underwater. Steve Harvey pulled his hand from his pocket. In it was his phone. His fingers moved across the screen with surprising steadiness for a man whose entire body was trembling. He was searching for something, scrolling through files and folders, his face a mask of concentration and desperate hope. "I keep a record," he said, almost to himself. "Photos from meet and greets, signed pictures, moments I want to remember. I've kept them all, backed them up. Because sometimes you need to remember that you met people who mattered." The studio held its breath. 300 people suspended in the space between what was and what might be, watching Steve Harvey search through the digital archive of his life, hoping for a miracle that seemed too impossible to name. And then his face changed, softened, broke open. "Oh my God," he whispered. "I found it." He turned the phone toward Sarah, and even from a distance, even through tears that blurred her vision, she could see it a photograph of her brother, young and alive, and grinning in his uniform, standing next to Steve Harvey. And beneath it, just visible on the screen, was the image of another photo, the signed one, the one meant for her, with Steve's handwriting scrolling across it in a message her brother had never lived to deliver. Sarah made a sound that wasn't quite a word, wasn't quite a scream, wasn't quite anything that had language attached to it. It was pure grief and joy colliding, the sound of a wound being touched after 11 years of trying not to acknowledge it existed. Steve was moving now, stepping off the stage, crossing the distance between them with purposeful strides. The professional boundaries that usually governed these interactions had dissolved completely. This wasn't a host and a contestant anymore. This was two people who'd loved the same brave, beautiful soul, finding each other in the wreckage of his absence. When Steve reached Sarah, he didn't speak. He just showed her the phone, let her see the photo up close, her brother. So young, so alive, his arm around Steve Harvey's shoulders, that smile that she'd memorized from 1,000 other photos, but had never seen quite like this, illuminated by stage lights and hope and the last good night he'd have before the world took him away. "The message," Sarah breathed. "What did you write?" Steve swiped to the next image. The signed photo, preserved digitally, even though the physical copy had been lost somewhere between Jacksonville and Afghanistan, between intention and tragedy, between a brother's love and a sister's birthday that would forever be marked by absence. The message was simple, written in Steve's distinctive scrawl. To Sarah, "Your brother says you're the real hero. Keep being the light. You've already changed the world by changing him. Steve Harvey." Sarah read it once, twice. Then she crumpled into Steve Harvey's arms, and he held her the way you hold someone who's been carrying too much for too long, the way you hold someone who finally has permission to fall apart because someone else is strong enough to keep them standing. The audience wasn't watching a show anymore. They were bearing witness to something ancient and holy, the moment when grief finds its testimony, when loss finds its listener, when two strangers discover they're bound together by a love that outlived the person who connected them. Steve's face was pressed against the top of Sarah's head, and his shoulders shook with sobs he'd held back for as long as he could. "I'm so sorry," he kept saying. "I'm so sorry I didn't know. I'm so sorry he didn't make it home. I'm so sorry you never got to read this." But Sarah was shaking her head against his chest, her words muffled but fierce. "I'm reading it now." He made sure I'd read it. Even now, even all these years later, he's still keeping his promises. The cameras kept rolling because no one had told them to stop, and later, when this footage would be watched millions of times, people would pause on this moment, two people holding each other under television lights, surrounded by strangers who'd become witnesses, connected by a soldier who'd believed in laughter and light even in the face of darkness, who'd loved his sister enough to wait after a comedy show to get her a message from a man she admired, who'd carried that photo in his pocket right up until the moment he ran toward danger to save a child's life. Marcus Wheeler had been gone for 11 years, but in that studio, in that impossible moment of connection, he was more present than he'd been in over a decade. Present in the way his sister still carried his photo. Present in the way Steve Harvey had never forgotten a 20-minute conversation. Present in the way his love had built a bridge across time and death, and all the miles between Jacksonville and this studio, between a comedy club and a game show, between a promise made and a promise finally, impossibly kept. When Sarah finally pulled back from Steve's embrace, her face was transformed. Not healed grief that deep doesn't heal in moments, doesn't dissolve under studio lights no matter how much love is present, but changed somehow, softened, as if something that had been clenched tight inside her chest for 11 years had finally, carefully, begun to unfold. Steve kept one hand on her shoulder, steadying her, steadying himself. His other hand still held his phone, that digital bridge to a night in Jacksonville when a young soldier had been alive and full of plans and certain that he'd make it home to surprise his sister. The studio had gone so quiet you could hear the hum of the electrical systems, the whisper of the air conditioning, the collective breathing of 300 people who'd forgotten they were supposed to be watching entertainment. "Can I?" Steve started, then stopped, looking at Sarah with an expression that was part question, part request, part prayer. "Can I tell you what else he said that night? About you?" Sarah nodded, unable to speak, and Steve guided her gently to sit down on the edge of the stage. Her family gathered around her, her husband, her daughters, creating a circle of protection and support. Steve sat beside her, this giant of television and entertainment, sitting like an old friend on a porch, like someone who had all the time in the world, because some conversations are more important than schedules or commercial breaks or the machinery of production. The director had made a decision in the control room. Let it run. Cancel the commercial breaks. This was bigger than advertising revenue. This was the kind of moment that reminded everyone why they'd gotten into television in the first place, not for the ratings or the recognition, but for those rare instances when the medium becomes a vessel for something true. "He talked about the day your parents died," Steve said softly, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying in that sacred silence. "About how you came home from college and you didn't cry in front of him because you wanted to be strong. About how you sat him down at the kitchen table and you told him everything was going to be okay, and he believed you because you'd never lied to him before." Sarah's breath hitched. These were details she'd never shared with anyone, private moments from the worst day of her life, and hearing them come from Steve Harvey's mouth in a television studio felt like listening to her brother's voice carried across impossible distances. "He said you got 2 jobs the next week," Steve continued. "Told the school you'd be back when you could, but your baby brother needed you more than you needed a degree. He said you worked mornings at a diner and nights cleaning office buildings. And when he asked you if you were tired, you'd say, 'Tired is temporary,'" Sarah whispered, finishing the sentence. And Steve nodded. "That's right. Tired is temporary, but family is forever." That's what you told him. And he said you lived that way for 2 years until he graduated high school. Until he was accepted to college on a football scholarship. Until you knew he'd be okay. Tears were streaming down Sarah's face, but she was smiling now too, that complicated expression that happens when grief and gratitude exist in the same moment, when remembering hurts and heals simultaneously. "He wanted to pay you back," Steve said. "That's why he joined the military. Not just for the service, though he believed in that too, but because the benefits would let him get his education and help you finish yours. He had this whole plan. He was going to serve his time, get his degree, and then you two were going to teach at the same school. He said he'd already picked it out. Said there was a high school in your hometown that needed good teachers, and he wanted you to work side by side, the way you'd done everything else." Sarah's hand had found her husband's, gripping it like an anchor. Her daughters were crying too, learning about an uncle they'd known only through stories and photographs, discovering that he'd had dreams that included their mother, plans that stretched beyond his own life into a future where love compounded and family remained the center of everything. "I asked him if he was scared," Steve said, and now his own voice was thick with emotion again. "About deploying, about going to Afghanistan, and you know what he said?" Sarah shook her head, leaning forward as if she could close the 11-year gap through sheer force of wanting to hear her brother's voice one more time. He said, "My sister taught me that fear is just love, wearing a different coat. I'm scared because I love my life and the people in it. But she also taught me that love means showing up, even when you're scared, especially then." And then he laughed and said, "Besides, I promised her I'd come home, and I don't break promises to my sister." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the cameras seemed to stop moving. The operators frozen in their understanding that they were recording something that transcended television, that belonged to the category of moments people would remember decades from now, would tell their children about, would mark as a dividing line between before and after. Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. An old-fashioned gesture, the kind his own mother had taught him, the kind that belongs to a generation that understood that some things require ceremony, require care. He handed it to Sarah, and she took it, pressed it against her face, breathed into its folds. "He kept his promise," Steve said quietly. "Maybe not the way he planned, maybe not in the way either of you imagined, but he came home to you today. Through this, through me, through whatever force in the universe made sure you'd be standing on this stage, holding his picture, on a day when I'd be here to see it and remember him." Sarah looked up at Steve, and in her eyes was something like wonder, like the first light of dawn after the longest night. "You gave him his last good memory," she said. "Before he deployed, before everything, you gave him a night of laughter. You gave him something to give to me. You gave him joy." Steve shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am. Your brother had joy because you gave him everything that matters. I just got to witness it for a few minutes. I just got to be in the orbit of the love you built." He stood then, and offered Sarah his hand, helping her to her feet. The audience rose with them. Not in applause, but in solidarity, in recognition, in the kind of standing that happens when people know they've been part of something sacred. The lights seemed softer now, gentler, as if even the machinery of television production had learned reverence. "I want to make sure you get this," Steve said, holding up his phone. "The photos, the message, everything your brother wanted you to have. It's 11 years late, but it's yours. It was always yours." Sarah nodded, and Steve immediately called for a staff member, began the process of making sure these digital fragments of her brother's last good night would be preserved, printed, delivered into her hands as Marcus had intended all those years ago. The game show was forgotten. The points, the prizes, the competition, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was this: two people connected by a soldier's love, finding each other across the chasm of his absence, discovering that some promises outlive the people who make them, that some love is strong enough to bend time and circumstance and bring witnesses together when they're needed most. And in the silence of that studio, in the soft light that had somehow become cathedral-like, in the space between what was lost and what was found, Marcus Wheeler's spirit seemed to hover, not gone, never gone, but transformed into the love he'd left behind, the promises he'd kept, the sister he'd raised and the life he'd saved, and the moment he'd created without ever knowing he was creating it. Sometimes healing doesn't announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in a television studio, through the testimony of a comedian who remembered a 20-minute conversation, through a photograph carried in a wallet for 11 years, through the simple recognition that love doesn't end when a heart stops beating, it just finds new ways to speak. The episode aired 3 weeks later on a Tuesday night. The network had debated heavily this wasn't the format, wasn't what sponsors had paid for, wasn't the neat package of entertainment that filled time slots and generated ratings. But something in the raw footage made the decision for them. Maybe it was the way Steve Harvey's hands had trembled when he recognized Marcus Wheeler's face. Maybe it was Sarah's collapse into grief and gratitude. Maybe it was simply the undeniable truth of it that sometimes television stops being a medium and becomes a mirror, reflecting back the best of what it means to be human. Within 72 hours, the clip had been viewed over 50 million times. But numbers can't capture what actually happened. They can't measure the phone calls that were made, adult children calling parents they'd been meaning to forgive, siblings reaching across years of silence, veterans calling the families of fallen brothers to say, "I remember him, and I'm sorry I never told you." They can't quantify the letters that poured into the network, into Steve Harvey's management office, into Sarah's school. Thousands of them, from strangers who needed to testify that they too carried photos of people they'd lost, that they too had promises that outlived the people who made them. Sarah returned to her kindergarten classroom in North Carolina, but she was different now. Not healed, grief that deep doesn't heal. It transforms, but lighter somehow, as if she'd been carrying a question for 11 years and finally received an answer. She hung the photo Steve had sent her, properly printed and framed, in her classroom beside her desk. When her students asked who the soldiers were, she told them, "That's my brother Marcus, and that's his friend Steve. They're reminding me that love is stronger than distance, and promises are stronger than time." The signed photo, the one Steve had given Marcus that night in Jacksonville, the one that had existed only as a digital ghost for 11 years, was recreated. Steve didn't just reprint it. He flew to North Carolina on a Tuesday afternoon, walked into Sarah's classroom unannounced, while 25 kindergartners sat in a circle for story time, and presented it to her in person. He stayed for 2 hours, reading to the children, talking about Marcus, listening as Sarah's students shared their own stories of people they loved. Before he left, he established a scholarship in Marcus Wheeler's name for students who'd overcome loss to pursue education, who embodied the same fierce determination to turn grief into purpose. Steve never forgot again. Every year on the anniversary of Marcus's death, he posted the photo of them together, the soldier and the comedian, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning in the belief that time stretched endlessly forward. The caption was always simple: Sergeant Marcus Wheeler, hero, brother, friend, still keeping promises. And every year, the comments filled with other photos, other names, other brothers and sisters and children and parents who deserved to be remembered. The episode became something of a pilgrimage for people carrying their own grief. They wrote to say they'd watched it alone in hospital rooms waiting for news, in empty houses after funerals, in the quiet hours of night when loss felt unbearable. They wrote to say it had given them permission to feel, to remember, to believe that love survived even when people didn't. They wrote to say they'd finally opened the boxes of belongings they'd been afraid to touch, finally looked at the photos they'd been avoiding, finally spoke the names they'd been holding silent. And Sarah began to understand that her brother's last promise hadn't been broken after all. He'd said he'd come home to her, and he had, just not in the way either of them expected. He'd come home through a comedy club conversation that Steve Harvey never forgot, through a photograph carried across 11 years, through the strange mathematics of television and timing that put her on a stage on exactly the right day to finally receive the message Marcus had died trying to deliver. Sometimes grace arrives disguised as coincidence. Sometimes the universe conspires to keep promises that people can no longer keep themselves. Sometimes a game show stops being entertainment and becomes a cathedral. A television studio transforms into sacred ground, and a comedian remembers a soldier just long enough for love to find its way home. And somewhere, in a classroom in North Carolina, 25 kindergartners learn their ABCs beneath a photograph of two men who understood that the most important lessons have nothing to do with letters or numbers, only with showing up for the people you love, keeping your promises, even when it's hard, and believing that somehow, against all logic and reason, love finds a way to speak across every distance, even the one between life and death. Marcus Wheeler had been gone for 11 years. But that Tuesday in the studio, through tears and photographs and the testimony of two people who refused to let him be forgotten, he'd never been more alive. And in the hearts of millions who watched, who witnessed, who remembered their own lost loves and unkept promises, something shifted, a reminder that we're all connected by invisible threads of love and loss, that every person we meet might be carrying someone else's last promise, that the kindness we show strangers might be the exact grace someone has been praying for. Because television doesn't just entertain. Sometimes in those rare and precious moments when the cameras capture truth instead of performance, it heals. It reminds us. It brings us home. Before you go, take a moment. Who's the one person you wish could have seen this story? Tag them or tell us their name below, because love doesn't end when a story does. And if this reminded you why kindness still matters, subscribe and share so the world never forgets moments like these. This is Stories Left Behind, where every act of love finds a home.